I have lived my whole life in a city that is bursting with contradiction, weighed down by a historical phantom that somehow still exists. Richmond is very frequently known around the country and the world as being the former capital of the Confederacy, yet that period in its history lasted less than 4 years. The years after the war are not often given such emphasis, even though an incredible amount of activism and organization occurred between then and now. The social, economic, and political reality of Richmond's history are rarely learned from when examining our present situation. Perhaps nowhere else in the world have the forces of race and class meant so much to a country's existence, but contemporary analysis fails to include it as little more than background noise. Here we will examine many historical accounts of the city since emancipation, which show how these two giant forces worked together and worked against each other. While race and class are the main topics and the narrative revolves around Richmond specifically, it would be impossible to talk about these forces without also giving the context about the history of black civil rights and voting rights in Virginia as well, so attention will be paid to major events pertaining to that. When someone considers the post-Civil War situation in the fallen Confederate capital, one could not be blamed for thinking it was probably a bleak situation for black people and abolitionists. As the first military district in the newly rejoined southern states, Virginia became a microcosm of greater racial and class tensions throughout the country. The pass system, imposed by federal troops, hindered the free movement of recently emancipated black Virginians to such an extent that until it ended, it was hard to truly feel free. However, this also meant that there were key progressive forces in Virginia that mirrored the greater countrywide efforts to transcend and bridge this racial divide. These forces are not often discussed when learning about Virginia's history, and many seem to be purposefully veiled by regressive forces wishing to subvert the true narrative of Virginia's long fight for civil rights. Still, it is important to start this talk giving context to the struggles immediately after black emancipation. Though freed from the grisly system of chattel slavery, more subtle methods of oppression began. 24 African Americans were elected to roles as delegates in ratifying the Virginia Constitution of 1868, despite backlash from many of the ex-Confederate locals. There were many very important decisions made at this convention, one of which made public schools free to every child. It also greatly expanded the local government systems, which made it more reminiscent of what we have today. The landmark decision, however, was in giving suffrage to all men of 21 years and older, regardless of race. Perhaps one of the most influential black Republicans at the convention was Thomas Bain, a dentist who escaped slavery from Norfolk to Massachusetts in 1855. After the Civil War, he returned to Norfolk to advocate for his community. It was finally ratified in July of 1869. The so-called Colored National Labor Union was created in 1869 in Washington, D.C. It was formed in response to the larger organization of the same name, the National Labor Union, barring entry to black American workers. With this disunity among the laboring classes, it was easy for the business and industrial elite to break strikes from both sides of the racial divide. The CNLU's meeting in Richmond set the tone for organized labor militancy throughout the city for decades, as it gave formal voice to the social networks that had formed in the years following emancipation. Though the CNLU lost most of its influence by 1872 and faded away, the spirit wasn't lost. The Richmond City Council, fearing the unified and organized force of Black Richmond, continued their efforts in political containment and carved up Richmond into 6 wards. The majority of the black population in Richmond was strategically placed inside of a single ward, still known today as Jackson Ward, though the boundaries since have changed immensely. The other 5 wards each had a white majority, which diluted the newly found political power of black Richmonders rather successfully. This did not, however, tamp down their political ambitions. Unified once more against these efforts of opposition and containment, 3 black Richmonders were nominated for city council from Jackson Ward, and won. Though more of a symbolic victory than a substantial gain, it proved the resilience and adaptability of this progressive force in Richmond. By 1873, much of the institutional power had unfortunately been rolled back. but underground social networks maintained their presence and kept up the fight. With conservative victory throughout the 1870s in Richmond, it became a clear goal to repeal and hinder the rights that were gained by black people in the years following the Civil War's end. A constitutional amendment was proposed and ratified by the conservative majority in 1876 that imposed restrictions on voting rights towards petty criminals and required a poll tax to be paid. This was strategic by the forces of aggression to disenfranchise as many black voters as they could, but it was a temporary backslide. The tug-of-war continued, and thanks to the rise and prominence of the Readjuster Party, the poll tax was repealed in 1882. The Readjuster Party in Virginia began in 1877, and it enjoyed a varied amount of support from both sides of the political aisles. From former conservatives that disagreed with their party's new policies of austerity, to former radical Republicans that fought for full black suffrage, people from many political camps were unified, centrally on the issue of funding for the public school system. Though Black Richmond was understandably skeptical and wary of any more white paternalism, and both radical Republicans and black independents openly spoke out against them, eventually there was enough support in Virginia to propel them into control of the General Assembly. They also facilitated the almost doubling of the amount of black schools in Virginia in just a year. The limitations of the Readjusters were quite obvious to their black electorate, however. Despite pressures from independent black organizations, the Readjusters failed to support key issues, such as anti-lynching measures and the decriminalization of interracial marriage. In fact, interracial marriages would be kept illegal in Virginia until 1967, with the Supreme Court decision of Loving v. Virginia. The Knights of Labor were one of the first large bottom-up organizations in the early United States. They sought to unite all branches of honorable toil. Their peak membership was around 700,000 men, and they left the largest mark on 19th century American labor history than any other organization. Their inclusion of women and African Americans as well were absolutely radical for their time, and this garnered both widespread support and condemnation from the American population. Their opposition to convict labor was also a unifying message among workers of all races. In 1886, it was decided that the Knights of Labor General Assembly would be held in Richmond, Virginia. However, conflict arose before the convention even began. Much attention was paid to the convention by local media outlets in Richmond, mostly focusing on the racial questions rather than for their support of labor rights. On October 5th, their attendance at a performance of Hamlet at the Richmond Academy of Music incensed many more locals when Frank Farrell sat in the whites-only section of the theater. The fears of other such events drove the police force to be doubled, and a crowd of several hundred or several thousand, sources differ, to amass at another theater to stop it from occurring, though no others ever did. The Knights' leadership's betrayal or fear of social equality brought them limited success in the South, and this also greatly limited their impact on the lives of black workers in the South. The Barrett Resolution was passed among the Knights that formally allowed Southern branches to discriminate along racial lines. Eventually, the prevailing powers had won out, and social equality was a vanishing sentiment in the Southern Knights of Labor. Still, their contributions to both economic and social equality in the South cannot be underplayed, as during this time, there were quite literally no other organizations performing these important tasks and fostering these important conversations. Despite its subsequent decline, it pushed the envelope on contemporary issues in a way that had lasting social effects far outside and independent of their organization. After the Knights of Labor faded from prominence in 1888, much like the many other working-class coalitions in Richmond, it was a swift return to the status quo of racial discrimination. From the end of the war and somewhat into the 1890s, these progressive coalitions, such as the Readjuster Party and the Knights of Labor, were able to influence Virginia politics and even win elections, though by the late 1890s and early 1900s, as well as with the enactment of a new undemocratic 1902 Virginia Constitution, this drive was eroded, and the regressive forces had made up considerable ground. Black Richmond and its allies never gave up the struggle, and despite over 80% of black men losing their rights to vote through poll taxes and grandfather clauses, Richmond remained a vital stronghold for what some historians call the long civil rights movement. Political failures of black Richmonders would be a theme of the first half of the 1900s. But where there was political failure, there was also modest social and economic success. Owing to their unfortunate and purposeful isolation in the city, Jackson Ward became an economic powerhouse for a decently thriving black community. However, the backlash to Reconstruction was strong. After years of rollbacks, the return to conservative rule culminated in another constitutional convention in 1902 that sought to disenfranchise the suffrage of black people and poor white people alike to work around the 14th and 15th Amendments. Virginians would not even be allowed to vote on this constitution, however, as the delegates feared electoral rejection, and so they decided with a vote of 47 to 38 to pass it without referendum. The results of this constitution were sweeping and incredibly damaging. With estimates of a black Virginia electorate almost 200,000 strong before the ratification, now dwindling to approximately only 15 to 20,000. In Richmond, an electorate of 6,000 had been sheared down to only 700. This was certainly a time of great tribulation to much of the black population in Virginia, and it would unfortunately remain in place for decades until the ratification of the Virginia Constitution of 1971. The Richmond City Council in 1911 began a trend throughout the state that allowed for the legal ordinance of residential segregation, and the Virginia General Assembly followed suit a year later in making it a statewide ordinance. However, the 1917 Buchanan v. Worley decision by the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that these ordinances were unconstitutional. Another legal segregation effort was in Virginia's 1929 Racial Integrity Act, which meant that one was not allowed to live in a neighborhood where they couldn't marry into the majority population. Since there were still so-called miscegenation laws on the books in Virginia, this was an attempted legal maneuver to legalize and enforce the segregation that already existed residentially. It was ruled unconstitutional in less than a year. However, housing covenants for specific neighborhoods began to arise in Richmond City and lasted until 1948, when they were finally struck down as unconstitutional as well. For one example, we can see a specific instance where the neighborhood of Windsor Farms had an explicit provision in their conditions and restrictions that barred black Richmonders from living there. Except for servants, the neighborhood was to remain whites only, and as we will see later on, not much has changed. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, worked closely with real estate agents in Richmond to draw up boundaries within the city to designate where giving out loans would be safest. This system was very blatantly based upon the racial composition of neighborhoods, and in many cases, white neighborhoods were given lesser ratings explicitly for being close to black or mixed neighborhoods. As one can see from the map, these areas to this day are black majority neighborhoods. The effects of these designations were directly felt for decades, as investments other than federal public housing practically dried up in the delisted areas. This created a cycle of poverty in these neighborhoods which exists into the present. Even after these real estate restrictions were deemed illegal, many of the practices remained on the private market, where redlining became joined with steering practices, aka selling homes in white neighborhoods to other whites and vice versa, as well as blockbusting, where a home would be sold to a black person to initiate the flight of whites in that neighborhood and to sell more homes. The SNYC was a profoundly influential civil rights organization that was founded in 1937. It had its first conference at the Fifth Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia, on February 13th. They sought to bring together an interracial coalition to further the rights to work and vote for African Americans. One of the first successful campaigns that was achieved by the SNYC was the unionization of over 5,000 tobacco workers in Richmond, Virginia. This union, called the Tobacco Stemmers and Laborers Union, was able to win a wage increase, as well as a 40-hour work week and an 8-hour workday for the factory workers. All these initial efforts had been mostly started by the black women workers themselves, one of whom, Mrs. Louise Mama Harris, was the organizer behind the spontaneous I.N. Vaughn factory strike in May. In 1956, The Richmond Crusade for Voters was founded on the heels and failures of the Council to Save Public Schools, when they unsuccessfully lobbied against a statewide referendum to allow local governments to shut down public schools that had integrated. There was an incredible backlash in Virginia after the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision, and segregationists were coming out in full force to stall any progress. Seeing the failure and the disappointing black voter turnout, the Richmond Crusade for Voters saw a need to educate and galvanize black voters to further participate. Dr. William Ferguson Reed was a co-founder of the Crusade who grew up in Richmond. He was elected to the Virginia General Assembly in 1968, making him the first African American elected since 1891 during Reconstruction. Though progress was at first slow, their patience paid off. More than just voter registration, they also made sure municipal services were being offered in black communities. By 1966, the number of registered black voters in Richmond had risen to 32,000, almost 4 times what it had been since the organization had begun their efforts. This undoubtedly contributed to the success of L. Douglas Wilder's campaign for state senator in 1969, once again a first since Reconstruction, and he would also later become the first black governor in 1990. A shadow of its former self, once described in glowing terms such as Black Wall Street and the Harlem of the South, Jackson Ward has become yet another story of social and economic dissolution for Black America. One of the most devastating blows to this once thriving community was the expressway built at the demand of the Virginia General Assembly. Before all of this began, Jackson Ward was home to over 100 black-owned businesses, including 6 banks. The 1942 creation of Gilpin Court, a public housing project created at the behest of white authorities, cut off a large portion of Jackson Ward. The result was further isolation and segregation, where lower-income African Americans were funneled into the housing projects of Gilpin Court and elsewhere after World War II. Creighton Court's creation in 1950 also helped to further entrench the East End's role as the segregated public housing area for black people, while poor white Richmonders were funneled to the South Side. An estimated 4,700 housing units were destroyed in black neighborhoods throughout the 1950s, including in Jackson Ward, and were replaced with only 1,700 public housing units. Some of the most widespread destruction came from the creation of the Richmond-Petersburg Expressway, now I-95, and the Belvedere Street extension, which from 1955 to 1957 displaced approximately 7,000 African Americans and carved through the center of the historic ward. The downtown expressway, a decade later, would lead to thousands more losing their home. Like many places around the United States at this time, Richmond had many civil rights demonstrations happen. One such event is dubbed the Protest of the Richmond 34, in honor of the 34 black students that were arrested on the second day of sit-in demonstrations at the Thalheimer's department store. Following Johnson v. Virginia in 1963, Southern courtrooms were desegregated after the civil disobedience of a black man when a judge told him to get out of the whites-only section in a courtroom. Another case was Green v. New Kent in 1968, which began the school busing program to continue desegregation efforts throughout the counties and cities. As mentioned previously, Loving v. Virginia in 1967 overturned laws in 17 states that once banned interracial marriage. Specifically for Virginia, it overturned the Racial Integrity Act, which also mentioned previously was used in the creation of white enclaves in Richmond such as Windsor Farms and Westover Hills. This was a period of incredible social change, as the landscapes of race and class were shifting radically, even in Richmond. With the national civil rights movement gaining institutional steam throughout the 1960s, both the local Richmond forces of progress and backlash were waiting to strike in the 70s. There had been many attempts to annex parts of the surrounding counties in a dual effort to increase revenue and dilute Black Richmond's population, but none had truly stuck until the annexation of 23 square miles of Chesterfield County in 1969. This decreased the black population of Richmond from a majority of 52% down to 42%. The at-large elections in Richmond meant that the new addition of mostly white Chesterfield would blatantly influence the composition of city council. After being wrung through several courts, Curtis Holt had his lawsuit heard by the Supreme Court. With a tense 5-3 ruling, it was decided that has switched from at-large elections to single-member districts which satisfy the requirements of the Voting Rights Act. As a result of the electoral changes and organizers' abilities to adapt, Henry L. Marsh was appointed as the first black mayor of Richmond in 1977. Though tangible gains towards political equality were made in the 1970s, black Richmonders faced a perpetual crisis of economic inequality. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 25.2% of black people lived below the poverty line, whereas only 8.3% of white people did. An astonishing 67.6% of people living in Gilpin Court lived below the poverty line. By the numbers, functional segregation increased in Richmond between the 1960s and the 1980s, despite it being de jure illegal. White flight had exacerbated this problem since as early as the 1930s, and between the years of 1970 and 1980, 39,000 white people left the city. Opportunities retreated to the surrounding suburbs, and despite the best efforts and intentions of the newly elected black leadership, greater forces of regression were at play. To jump now to the present, we can clearly see the effects of the centuries-long tug-of-war and the neighborhood disparities that still exist. A 2015 study of life expectancy in Richmond showed that in less than 6 miles, life expectancy varied by 20 years. The stark realities of racism are held within this statistic, as Gilpin Court has an approximate life expectancy of 63 years, whereas it is 83 years in Westover Hills, 80 years in Windsor Farms, and 77 years in the Museum District. Differences between these neighborhoods which led to these results are far too numerous to efficiently list, but to discuss just a few, it will become obvious that this is still a pervasive issue. The grim legacy of redlining never seemed to lose its effect upon the neighborhoods deemed undesirable by Hulk. Even after almost 100 years, these areas are still predominantly poor and predominantly black, and the data shows clearly that environmental degradation and pollution are still major issues in these neighborhoods. The prevalence of food deserts and food swamps in the east end of Richmond and Henrico can probably account for many of these issues, as food insecurity in the city is more than double what it is in Chesterfield County and almost double that of Henrico County. Infant mortality in Richmond was also nearly double the state average of 6.3%. Due to fewer green spaces, temperature differences between neighborhoods such as Gilpin Court and Westover Hills can reach up to 20 degrees during the hotter months, as tree coverage and more substantial urban highway planning allow for cooler streets and better air quality. However, while increasing green space in these areas is a noble endeavor for the city to undertake, it must not also come with a cost of displacement and gentrification. A troubling statistic speaks to the need to continue the fight. Where 24% of children in Richmond lived in poverty in 1969, it grew to 39% after the 2008 recession. 80% of Richmond's public school population was black in 2010, whereas the city's black population was approximately only 50%. A recent VCU and Pennsylvania State University study published in April of 2021 highlighted the cumulative effects that the long history of racist policies has created, as black people, regardless of income and class, are still, on average, denied institutional resources and support. This comes in the form of still lower quality schools than majority white West End schools, much as it was in the days of legal segregation. The effects of decades of disinvestment and white flight sapped Richmond schools of resources and have left them in constant disrepair and disrepute. Since 2003, metrics have even shown that segregation in some of Virginia's metropolitan school systems have worsened. According to the Princeton University Eviction Lab, Richmond has the second highest eviction rate of any major city in America, at a rate of 11% as of 2016. These have disproportionately affected black neighborhoods, of which 60% of these predominantly black tracts face eviction rates north of 10%. As one can see, segregation still remains an issue in the city to this day. For one last example, the Windsor Farms neighborhood we talked about earlier that explicitly barred black people from living there now resides in Census Tract 506. In this area of the city, according to the 2020 census redistricting data, there are only 33 black people reported to be living here, out of a total of 2,600. With the demolition of the Confederate monuments in Richmond, a new era has begun. However, much like the initial black electoral victories on city council during Reconstruction, without substantive change, this victory is little more than symbolic. It would be a mistake to see the absence of these monuments and think our mission is complete. An incredible amount of work still must be done, as one can see, and though progress has been significant, decades-long and centuries-long disparities still exist.